Hello, everyone. Our presentation is tackling the grand challenge of reducing extreme economic inequality, and we are specifically going to look at Tennessee and how geography influences access to opportunity. While Tennessee has experienced significant growth and development, that growth has not been experienced equally across all communities. Um, We'll start out by exploring the grand challenge itself, followed by a broad, zoomed out look at a national economic inequality and why this topic matters. We will explore how poverty, housing affordability, employment opportunities, transportation, and access to resources create different challenges across rural and metropolitan areas of the state. And through examining rural Tennessee, Knoxville, Memphis, and Nashville, we will highlight how where a person lives can shape their ability to access healthcare, employment, affordable housing, and social supports. And we'll wind down with looking at some barriers to change and existing interventions in play already. This topic is especially relevant to social work because understanding systemic barriers allows practitioners to better advocate for individuals, communities, and policies that promote equity.
So first, I'm going to start with explanation of the grad challenge. Social workers cannot effectively address individual problems without understanding the structural conditions that create those problems. With this in mind, we want to focus on how we can close extreme economic inequality gap and provide real statistics experienced by Tennessee residents. I think this was super important for us, especially talking about extreme economic inequality, especially looking at today's wealth gaps. We really just want to give an overall review of what it looks like and kind of help people understand where poverty comes from and how it affects people that we serve. And economic inequality is connected to many social problems. Inequality contributes to homelessness, unaffordable housing, health disparities, educational disadvantages, and problems within the criminal legal system. Inequality is different from poverty. A person can be above the poverty line but still experience economic disadvantages compared to wealthier groups. I think this was extremely important to add. I think it really stuck up out for me because you can be experiencing inequality, but you could be living within your means. Or, a lot of times nowadays, those people that are experiencing inequality can't are struggling to live above within their means. They're the system has failed them and they can't afford basic necessities, and then therefore but if you look at their income, it says they are above the poverty line, based on the state's limits of national poverty limits, but they literally cannot afford to provide for their basic needs. The causes are structural and interconnected. Understanding globalization, changes in technology, differences in education and skills, declining unionization, unstable employment, tax policies, racial discrimination, and political influence by wealthy individuals and corporations as factors contributing to inequality. At the end of the day, we look at the big Fortune 500 companies and how their influence has impacted the way that groceries are priced, the way basic necessities are priced, and they keep boxing out the people that can barely afford their basic needs now, and understanding how a lot of different factors affect inequality is essential to looking at our economic inequality overall. um, Racial inequality is deeply connected to economic inequality. Looking at our history and looking at how historically overall everyone has always been, if you're a person of color or a minority, you have been you have been treated that way, and have not had the opportunities that other wealthier racial groups have been able to afford. And so that is true, and that is in our history, and that is something that we can look at and be like, yep, this is what has created this gap. Overall, social workers have an important role in addressing inequalities. Social work needs both micro and macro level approaches to tackle the challenges faced by groups experiencing the extreme inequality. These looking at macro level policies, like we really need to look at how the state is supporting our communities, and how are they having detrimental effects, and what are things that we can do as social workers to help fight for social justice for these groups of people.
Okay, let's start the analysis by zooming our macroscope out and taking a look at the history of economic inequality in the US. This interactive tool on the left comes directly from federalreserve.gov and shows the distribution of household wealth since 1989 in trillions of dollars. As you can see, the top 0.1% of people in the country represent the dark green. Extending to the top 1% will include the lighter shade of green, and extending to the top 10% will pull in the light blue portion as well. And if you can imagine this graph as a pie, that slice for the top 10% is well over half of the country's collective wealth. What I want you to really focus on is the tiny yellow slice of the pie that represents the bottom 50% of people since 1990 and how little their collective wealth accumulation has moved since we've started collecting this data. If you look below the chart, you'll see a couple of snapshots, one at Q3 of 1990 and another at Q1 of 2026. The Excel spreadsheet expands the math a bit by showing the percentages of the total wealth held between the two dates, and the trend over the 36-year gap shows a huge increase for those at the top and a decrease for those at the bottom. Of note, seeing that the top 10% in 1990 held almost 60% of the wealth and has moved up to about 68% now, whereas the bottom 50 held 3.5% in 1990 and 2.45% now. A quick glance in the top right will also show a similar trend in incomes for the top 1% share going up in the same time range and the bottom 50 going down. And before we move on, I just want to highlight that a large part of the reason why our global economic impact, GDP, and perceived value of the US dollar are so high rests on decades of wealth accumulation that, as we can see, is highly concentrated within a small percentage of our population. I believe this raises important questions about how we understand wealth creation. Our current economic structures can create a mindset that those at the top are solely responsible for the innovation and productivity that generates this wealth, while overlooking the reality that it is also built through the contributions of millions of people further down the economic ladder. As we can see, those at the bottom are not sharing proportionally in that economic growth. After looking at wealth and income inequality, I wanted to flip the perspective. Instead of asking who has the most wealth, I started asking, how do we decide who needs help? Looking globally for different examples, I found it interesting that the US still relies on a poverty measure rooted in a 1960s methodology, while the UK uses a relative measure tied to current median income. The US formula was based around food being one-third of your budget, and the other two-thirds of your income would solve housing, clothes, utilities, all other expenses. I think that this is a limited view and that it really only controls for one variable and assumes that the multitude of other cost of living variables are always relative to food costs adjusted for inflation. And what has happened in the US is that our social support systems have had to supplement the official poverty measure by using things like area of median income percentages to more accurately reflect those in need. If we were to very roughly estimate a similar UK pattern on top of the US numbers, that could raise the national poverty line in 2026 from 15,960 for a single person household to roughly 50,000 in a very loose theoretical lens. Now, I'm not suggesting we simply adopt the UK's formula. The systems are very different, but I do think it raises an important policy question. If many assistance programs already modify or supplement the official poverty measure, does that suggest it's worth reevaluating whether our national benchmark still reflects today's economic realities? These national trends we've discussed provide the framework. Now let's break down why this matters and then zoom into Tennessee and examine how these same patterns influence opportunity, access, and economic inequality in our own communities.
Next section I'm going to talk about is why it matters. Economic inequality is important because we have to examine how income, wealth, opportunities, and resources are distributed across society, and why some groups have significantly more economic power and security than others. It allows social workers to understand how individual and family challenges are connected to larger structural conditions. Specifically, looking at when we're looking at Middle, West, and East Tennessee, Middle Tennessee always has a lot more resources available because we are more closely together. You can drive from middle of Nashville to Murfreesboro if there's no traffic in like 30 minutes. Um, or like you can go from South Nashville to North Nashville in like 20 minutes. It just, and compared to looking at other counties and areas of Tennessee, it's harder to have those resources because people have to drive farther distances or go farther distances to be able to get to an office to be able to get support. And a lot of people that are living in those rural areas do not have access to a vehicle that can take them that far or someone that can help them that far. So, our resources are very sporadically portioned out around across Tennessee, and looking at how that affects the communities that we serve is essential to looking at inequality overall. Economic inequality affects access to housing, healthcare, education, employment, and opportunities to build wealth, disproportionately impacting marginalized and low income communities. That's very true. The grad challenge emphasizes that social workers must look beyond poverty as an individual's condition and examine the policies systems that create and maintain unequal access to resources. It's important for us to understand how the policies that of the people of each area of Tennessee and the people we serve, how these affect the people that we are trying to help and support, and finding ways to either help them through the system, or even find ways to fight against the system and create that social justice to be able to give them that support that they need, that they might have never had access to, or resources to be able to do that, or someone to even fight for them. By addressing extreme economic inequality, social workers can advocate for policies and promote greater equity, economic stability, and social justice while addressing the root causes of many problems experienced by the populations they serve. I think it's really important as a social worker to uh, advocate for our people, for the people that we serve, and try to create systems where we can help support them and find them financial stability, so then for we can address the underlying root causes of these issues. It might be they have mental health issues, but they need to get their their needs met first before we can even start talking about that. And if we are able to get their needs met, then we can maybe address some of the underlying root causes of this instability that they've experienced for years and years, and maybe create a new normal for them that will be sustainable for the life that they are living.
Before looking at specific communities, it's important to understand the larger economic landscape of Tennessee. Tennessee has experienced significant growth in population, business development, and employment opportunities. However, that growth has not benefited all residents equally. Economic inequality in Tennessee is strongly connected to geography. Where someone lives can influence their access to jobs, affordable housing, healthcare, transportation, and social services. Rural communities often face challenges related to fewer resources and employment opportunities, while growing metropolitan areas face rising cost of living and housing affordability concerns. The next two slides examine how these issues appear in different parts of Tennessee. First, we're going to look at rural Tennessee and how geographic isolation can become a barrier to opportunity. Then we will examine metropolitan areas like Knoxville and Nashville, where economic growth has created new affordability challenges. From a macro social works perspective, these challenges cannot be understood only as individual problems. They are influenced by larger social, economic, and political systems that shape access to resources and opportunities. Macro social work focuses on addressing these systematic barriers through policy advocacy, community organizing, program development, and efforts to create a more equitable system. Rather than asking why individuals are struggling, macro social work asks what community conditions, policies, and structures contribute to these inequalities. Although Tennessee has experienced growth, not all communities have benefited equally. Rural Tennessee demonstrates how geographically limited resources and barriers to access can influence persons' ability to find opportunity and maintain stable housing. Rural Tennessee highlights how a person's geographic location can significantly impact the access to resources, economic opportunities, and overall quality of life. While poverty exists throughout the state, rural counties often experience high levels higher levels of economic hardship compared to more urban areas. The map on this slide shows a county level poverty differences across Tennessee and helps visualize how poverty is not evenly distributed. Many rural communities face barriers that extend beyond income, including limited access to healthcare providers, reliable transportation, employment opportunities, and even broadband internet. For some residents, especially older adults, and individuals with limited financial resources living in rural areas can mean traveling long distance to access essential services such as medical care, employment, social supports, and these challenges can increase isolation and make it more difficult for individuals and families to improve their economic circumstances. From a social work perspective, understanding the role of geography is essential because barriers are not always individual challenges. They are often connected to larger systemic issues. Social workers must consider how transportation, infrastructure, healthcare availability, and economic development influence a person's ability to access opportunities and maintain stability. While rural communities face geographic barriers, urban and growing areas like Knoxville experience different challenges, including rising housing costs and affordability concerns. Knoxville represents how economic growth can create opportunities while also exposing larger systemic challenges. Like many metropolitan areas, Knoxville has experienced increased demand for housing, rising rental costs, and changes in the affordability of living in that community. As housing costs increase faster than wages, more households experience housing cost burden, meaning they're spending a significant portion of their income on housing. This creates broader social impacts because when people spend more on housing, they have fewer resources available for healthcare, transportation, food, education, and other basic needs. These challenges disproportionately affect low income workers, service employees, and individuals who already experiencing financial insecurity. Many workers may contribute to Knoxville's economic growth but still struggle to afford living near their workplaces, resulting in longer commutes and additional transportation barriers. Knoxville also demonstrates the connection between urban and rural inequality. Surrounding rural counties often experience lower wages, fewer employment opportunities, and reduced access to services. This creates a regional issue where opportunities may exist, but access to those opportunities not equal to all residents. While Knoxville highlights the affordability challenge that can accompany regional growth, Nashville shows how these same issues can intensify in one of Tennessee's fastest growing metropolitan areas. This slide examines how economic success can exist alongside persistent inequality. Nashville is often recognized as one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the Southeast, with significant population growth, economic development, and new employment opportunities. However, this growth has not benefited all residents equally. As Nashville has expanded, housing costs has increased significantly. Rent and home prices have risen faster than many workers' wages, creating affordability challenges for low and middle income households. Many residents now considered housing cost burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on housing, leaving fewer resources available for healthcare, transportation, food, and other necessities. This issue especially impacts service workers and other essential workers that contribute to Nashville's economy but may struggle to afford living near their workplaces. As housing becomes more expensive, many workers are forced to move further away and spend more time and money commuting. Nashville has also experienced changes related to gentrification as neighborhoods develop and property values increase. Some long term residents and lower income communities face displacement. This can disrupt established social networks and reduce access to familiar community resources. From a social work perspective, Nashville demonstrates that economic growth alone does not eliminate inequality. Social workers must consider how policies related to housing, transportation, employment, and community development affect vulnerable populations. Nashville shows that the challenges that can come with rapid growth, while Memphis highlights how historical and structural inequalities continue to affect communities. Together, these examples demonstrate that Economic inequality in Tennessee takes different forms depending on place, resources, and opportunity.
Memphis experiences economic inequality differently than Nashville and Knoxville because many of its challenges are rooted in decades of structural inequality rather than recent growth. Historic redlining, residential segregation, and long-term disinvestment have contributed to concentrated poverty and reduced economic mobility. Many communities continue to face barriers to quality education, healthcare, affordable housing, transportation, and stable employment. From a macro social work perspective, this highlights the need for equitable economic development, neighborhood investment, workforce development, and policy reforms that address systemic racial and economic disparities. Memphis reminds us that effective solutions must reflect each community's unique history and needs. Comparing all of these regions shows that economic inequality is not the same across Tennessee. Rural communities struggle with geographic barriers and limited access to services. Knoxville faces growing affordability challenges as housing costs increase. Nashville's rapid growth has created displacement and widening income gaps. Memphis continues to experience the effects of decades of structural inequality and disinvestment. While the challenges differ, they all demonstrate that macro social workers must advocate for policies and community level interventions that are tailored to each region rather than relying on one universal solution.
This case study demonstrates how geography can influence a person's ability to access opportunity. The Johnson family is working and contributing to their community, but systematic barriers achieve. From a macro social work perspective, the focus is not only on helping this family navigate these challenges, but also examining why these barriers exist. Limited transportation, healthcare access, employment opportunities are all community level issues that require larger systemic solutions. This case connects the larger theme of our presentation, where someone lives can shape their access to resources, and addressing inequality requires investment in communities and political opportunity. Throughout this presentation, we have seen that economic inequality in Tennessee is shaped by geography, resources, and access to opportunity. However, Tennessee also has opportunities to address these challenges through intentional investment and collaboration. On the opportunity side, growing public awareness has increased attention towards the issue. An issue such as affordable housing, healthcare access, and economic inequality. Cross sector partnerships between government agencies, nonprofits, businesses, and community organizations can help create more comprehensive solutions. Investments in workforce development, broadband expansion, affordable housing, and community wealth building initiatives can strengthen communities by increasing access to resources and creating pathways towards economic stability. At the same time, Tennessee continues to face significant challenges: rising housing costs, inflation, healthcare shortages in rural areas, childcare affordability, transportation barriers, and structural discrimination continue to limit opportunities for many residents. From a macro social work perspective, these challenges highlight the importance of systems level interventions. Individuals' support is important, but lasting change requires addressing policies, structures, and community conditions that create inequality. The goal is not only to respond to existing needs, but to build systems that allow Tennessee communities to thrive.
And then the last section I'm going to talk about is our Tennessee macro interventions that are in place. I'm talking about SNAP and TNAF, access for families in Tennessee. You know, this is a really great food resource for residents in Tennessee. Giving them, being able to buy healthy foods and be able to feed their families is an extremely valuable resource. Unfortunately, the books may not be balanced, and that's a policy that we will have to fight and help these families that are not receiving the SNAP and TNAF funds like they should be. But having that policy there does create an ability to have some families be able to access that resource. Another one is our workforce opportunities. A lot of nonprofits in town do a lot of workforce employment kind of access opportunities for people. I know Park Center is one that does one. I know Goodwill does one, and they really help with a job coach and being able to help them make sure that they're still receiving their benefits, but they're still be able to work and get that socialization that they need or and even crave for a lot of them because they are so socially isolated because of their economic inequalities. A lot of employers really don't want to hire someone that is low income, or they just believe not even low income, just like they have doubts about an employee. So, really helping them create spaces to be able to have that workforce opportunity is essential. Another great one is our community partnerships. A lot of our community partnerships all around Tennessee help create access to resources that low income families or families that need these opportunities wouldn't have had access to because they don't have funds to be able to do it. And so having these resources, community partnerships really help close that gap. I know, especially with back to school being so close, we have a lot of local in Middle Tennessee resources that are doing. Drives to be able to help kids get backpacks or school supplies, or even the tax-free weekend we just had. It really helps in some ways be able to close that gap so that kids can go to school and parents don't have to worry about if their kid has those access to those resources. And then the last one is Medicaid access. Being able to have health care is essential. I think a lot of people really struggle because they don't have access to these resources. And I think having that be able to be for everyone is essential because, healthcare is a basic need, not a right. It's a basic need. And having access for Tennessee residents to have this is essential to be able to for them to take care of their health, and then if they're able to take care of their health, they can address their mental health as well, which is what we want at the end of the day.
In summary, our goal wasn't simply to identify where inequality exists nationally or in Tennessee. It was to understand why it exists and what social workers can do about it. Geography, public policy, and access to opportunity all influence economic outcomes. While no single intervention will solve economic inequality, macro social work reminds us that systems can change. The same policies and institutions that contribute to inequality today can also become the tools that create greater opportunity tomorrow. Understanding economic inequality is only the first step. The real challenge and opportunity is using that understanding to create systems that expand opportunity for everyone.